Hello.
Hi, how are you, Taylor?
How's it going? I think we're live.
Okay. Um, I'm really excited about this conversation. For those of you who are watching who don't know me, I'm Imran Ahmed. I'm the founder and CEO of the Center for Countering Digital Hate, based here in Washington, D.C., in my basement, which doubles as an office. And I have with me someone I've known for some years now and that I've grown to really, really admire through her writing. Is Taylor Lorenz, who's the founder of usermag.co, which is online, and it's a great tech and online culture newsletter. She's a former journalist for the Washington Post and other really prestigious publications, but also the author of Extremely Online, The Untold Story of Fame, Influence, and Power on the Internet, which is just brilliant and eye-opening. And really, I think Taylor has been ahead of the curve on this whole new, people talk about online spaces, digital publishing, but she's really been right at the sort of bleeding edge of understanding that a new culture, a new sort of source of influence and change in the world, but also a new industry is being created. That people that, the heritage industries are kind of, they're either trying to ignore or they just don't understand. And she's the greatest guide, Sherpa to that world that I've ever met. So Taylor, it's really good to be with you.
Oh my gosh, I wish I should sing your praises now. But it's so great to be here. Yes, for people that follow me and don't know Imran, does wonderful work. I tagged his organization, Center for Countering Hate, in my caption. But they do just such great work, sort of calling out the rise of hatred and extremism online, which is a big problem.
Yeah, and I mean, today we're talking about misogyny and the manosphere. When I was learning about civil rights, I studied with a guy called Eric Ward, who ran the Western State Center in the US. And one of the things that he would always say is that the symbols, the language, what's called the semiotics of hatred in America is anti-Semitic at its core. Like, you scratch any racist, you find anti-Semitism. You look at any trope, you find an anti-Semitic antecedent to it. That there's that sort of there's that it is the original sin of hatred, was hating Jews. And I think that in digital spaces, that's not true anymore. I think that because of the contingent circumstances, the fact that it was basically young dudes sitting in basements like I am right now, on bulletin boards, like I did when I was 16, 15, 17, when I was at high school, because I'm not Gen Z or a millennial even. I'm Gen X. That those spaces, misogyny is the original sin of the internet. It's the original form of hatred. And in fact, hate movements that enter the digital space, they start to bring in and start to hybridize with misogynist elements. So the Proud Boys is a really good example of a digital first hate movement, which is not necessarily white supremacist. It's kind of white male chauvinist, and Western male chauvinist. And that male bit of it and the male chauvinism is a really critical component of their sort of ersatz ideology. But we're going to talk about incels today because adolescence.
Yes.
You've seen it.
No, I've just seen the clips of it, and I was asked to talk about it on TV, and I was like, I need to watch it before I go to pontificate about it on television. But everyone says it's really good.
You're in, like, I know that you're not technically Gen Z, but like, you are so Gen Z. You're like, I haven't actually watched it, but I have seen like a lot of TikTok clips from it.
I'm brain rotted. I think it sounds like a really interesting show, but I also like the reaction to it has been so extreme that I've just mostly been sort of like following that aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, something reaction. It's an interesting show, and it starts a discussion that's worth having.
Hmm.
And there's a lot that we have to worry about if young men are being encouraged to see the world in ways which fundamentally hurt them and encourage them to hurt others.
Yes.
So we did a piece of research a couple of years ago called Incelosphere, looking at the world's largest incels forum. We found some really disturbing things on there, things that I wouldn't necessarily want to describe on an open Instagram live about the use of sexual violence, and how comfortable, and in fact, how much those men encouraged each other to use sexual violence, not just against women, but children as well. And we, in the wake of adolescence, and also in the wake of, a series of elections in which some really strange things are happening with the voting patterns of young men, we've been looking again at this question of how are young men on the internet doing. And our latest research indicates the world's largest incels forum has doubled in size since we last studied it in 2022.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
I think I wrote about that actually.
You may have.
I did. I wrote about it. I wrote about that report. Yeah. For the Washington Post. The
Yes.
fact that it's doubled is terrifying because that was a vicious forum.
So, I mean, you remember what we were finding on there, and some of the
Yeah.
stuff was, if you have young daughters, would keep you up at night. Like, you wouldn't, like, if you, I mean, often I say, like, if you knew some of the stuff I knew and see some of the spaces I see, you'd find it hard to sleep at night. Now, look, the spread of extreme misogyny online by manosphere communities like incels has, in some cases, spread from like niche online forums to mainstream platforms.
Yes.
Like reaching even more young people. And online and offline hate feed each other. They can lead to real world violence. So let me ask you a big question first of all. What do you think it is about online spaces that makes them such a fertile ground for extreme misogyny?
Here's the thing. I think that there's a lot of latent misogyny in our culture, and it ends up reflected in these online spaces because people feel there's sort of like a permission structure for it online. Whereas there's not as much of a permission structure for it in the physical world because you're in an office setting, right? Or you're at dinner with friends where it would be sort of socially weird for you to express certain belief systems. But on the internet, you can sort of find communities that are sympathetic to extremist views, participate in those communities, and say horrible things, right? And like radicalize yourself essentially. And so I think that I think that that's the difference is like if these people were saying a lot of what they were saying IRL, people would check them on it because it's actually quite fringe. Well, traditionally has been quite fringe antisocial ideology. Now, unfortunately, what we've seen, especially over the past 5 years, is that that line is really going away where like these people are now completely comfortable saying a lot of this stuff IRL, which is dangerous. And we're seeing a lot of this violence manifest. I mean, we've seen it a long time manifesting IRL with shootings and stuff, but it's scary because like you said, I think it's just been so normalized, and it's been normalized not just by the internet, by people in power. I think that's another thing that we need to talk about is the way the far right has weaponized the internet, embraced the internet. The far right Trump movements was a really internet first movement, and they've been able to very successfully wield influence on these platforms to get themselves an enormous amount of political power. And then now that they have that power, they are mainstreaming this really extreme ideology and rhetoric. And so you have members of Congress saying things that, were unfathomable 20 years ago.
And it's a really reflexive process, like they affect each other and then it reflects back and then it reflects back, ever intensifying, because as you see more and more people use this kind of language, it intensifies, becomes normal. And then the question is, how do you say something which is more outrageous, more extreme, get those rage clicks in? That's really interesting. I mean, like, do you think there's it's one of the things I think about a lot is the design of social platforms, like the lack of a don't like. The fact that they're designed in certain ways that encourage certain.
Well, a dislike button, you mean?
Yeah.
We have that on YouTube, right? They had the dislike and then it was removed for like mental health. Like people were using it to make it was a sort of a mental health, like people were very upset about the dislike button because they would go out and say something like talk about feminism, right? And then be swarmed by dislikes, and then your video gets downranked, and like that was being abused.
Reddit still has it, right?
Yes, they have the downvote. Yeah.
And so I mean, and of course you're right. Every choice you make has trade-offs and has pros and cons. And so, but do you think the current configuration of design of social platforms that you are familiar with kind of actually encourages or makes this particularly a fertile ground for misogyny online, for extreme misogyny?
Yes, and part of that is because the tech CEOs themselves are expressing extreme misogyny. Like, look at Elon Musk, right? He's out there himself spouting misogyny. And some of the first people that he allowed to monetize on X and basically monetize outrage bait were deep misogynist far right extremists. I wrote about this also for the Washington Post. These are like some of the first people that ever got access to monetization. We've seen him funnel thousands of dollars. We have Mark Zuckerberg, who's now on this, manosphere. Like, I want more free speech for the men, not more free speech for women on Instagram talking about reproductive justice. No, they're still censored, and people should go to the Repro Uncensored project, by the way, which is great. You can report incidents of your reproductive justice content getting censored. But yeah, that's not getting free speechified, right? Like, what is like hatred towards women, especially. And so I think it's a top-down problem where these tech CEOs espouse this misogyny. They have a lot of misogyny, and so then that sort of gets imbued in the decisions that they make regarding a lot of these products.
Yeah, I mean, we did a study of on repro healthcare globally, working with one of the world's biggest charities that provides those services to people in the global majority countries, and they were having, ads taken down like really capriciously for no clear reason,
Yeah.
but at the same time there was paid advertising which was misleading people about reproductive health, which was paid for by US organizations pumping that into the developing world, where there may not be as much information resilience because there's not as much access to information. It's really disturbing, and I think you're really right. Like, there's something about that kind of broligarchy that is, they're really, I mean, I find their, can I just say something? I'll just say it out loud.
Yeah,
I find their masculinity incredibly fragile.
it
They're, they,
is. It
they're
is.
just desperately trying all the time to be like, yo, I'm a dude. I'm a man, a real man. And you're like, brother, if you have to say it 50 times, I suspect you may not believe it yourself.
I know. Well, it's like it's just this like it's not a widening view of masculinity. I think some of these men grew up like the nerdy guy or whatever, right? And now they have enormous money and power and they're like, "No, I'm actually the cool guy and I eat steaks and I love fighting people because that's the most manly thing you can do." And I just it's such a regressive view of masculinity, I think, but it also like I just think it reinforces these norms. And I just wish that we had a tech CEO, not to be like, where's the woke tech billionaire, but like, that had a little bit more progressive view of gender generally. Because another thing that we see censored constantly on the internet is LGBTQ content and content that's trying to educate people about like feminism and equality and, healthy masculinity, etc. So yeah, I mean, I think Meta and X, obviously, like YouTube is a huge problem too. And I've written about misogyny. I think maybe another one of your reports potentially about like misogyny on YouTube. Maybe it's all these platforms. They're overrun with this stuff, and they're monetizing. These men are able to monetize and build these massive businesses around hating women.
Yeah, it's odd and really disturbing, actually. Let me ask a sort of, in your experience, and you are one of the leading sort of thinkers and researchers and journalists who've been studying online spaces for a long time. Is this getting worse, or is it flatlining? Like, what's
Oh
the
no,
direction?
it's getting worse. Definitely getting worse. I mean, we just got Trump again. Like, I think that's like hopefully going to be a wake up call for Democrats that continue to ignore it. But I worry it's not, because so far what I've seen Democrats doing is like being like, yeah, we need to speak young men by, maybe we need to say slurs against women. Maybe that's how we reach the young men. It's like, oh my God, okay, so you're just going to try to like out misogyny, the misogynistic right? Like, what? That's the wrong lesson to take, I think. But I do think it's exacerbated by so many things. I mean, I think our political system is exacerbating it. I think the internet is exacerbating it. I think I think that, like you said, of misogyny, sort of the original sin of the internet, misogyny, these misogynistic hate campaigns, and I've written a lot about Gamergate in my book and how Gamergate became this playbook. It was this misogynistic hate campaign against a bunch of female game developers and women journalists in the early 2010s. That playbook has been replicated now to dismantle so many social justice movements and initiatives and progressive progress. You see this with Chris Rufo, who's a far right activist who's using Gamergate tactics, literally the misogynistic hate campaign. He's taken this exact playbook, and they talk about this openly, by the way, to attack DEI policies and to attack people of color, trans people as well, are subject to these same hate campaigns. So I think we need to look at the misogynistic hate that's happening and look at the way that these people weaponize misogyny to push a political agenda, and realize that that same playbook is being it doesn't just end with women. It ends with all oppressed people. They want to oppress everyone that is marginalized. And so
Yeah.
it's just important to pay attention, because I think people just ignore it when it happens to women, and that's really bad.
Yeah, no, a few months ago, I asked my teams internally at CCDH to turn their minds to the manosphere. So we've got all of our research teams currently working on various different research projects to do with extreme misogyny and what's called the manosphere that, frankly, it's not for all men. It's as usual with these movements, you find a small number of are you allowed to say asshole on Instagram Live? Like, yeah, like
I think
real.
so.
I mean, like, all
It's
right,
a free speech platform now. Imran, did you hear?
oh, yeah. But like, real assholes who control and seed really pernicious ideas. A couple of years ago, I had to debate on. I did Dr. Phil, and I had to debate Rollo Tomassi, the self-proclaimed godfather of male supremacism. And I remember just thinking, like, it's scary that that the way that platforms work is you are unchallenged on there, because actually your philosophy is so paper thin and superficial, and they use like superficial trappings of wealth and success to kind of bring people in, but actually it's a really hollow worldview. Now look, sorry,
I'm
go on.
sorry. I was
No,
just
no,
going
you
to say, I think the wealth thing is such a part of it, because I don't think you can sort of separate the rise of misogyny from like late capitalism, and specifically the American economic system, which it makes it very hard. And I think a lot of young people, especially young men, recognize how broken our economic system is and how stacked against it is, honestly, for everyone that doesn't come from wealth and power. And they see these people like Andrew Tate, and especially the rise of cryptocurrency has also exacerbated all of this, where it's like, you hustle hard enough, you start your e-commerce course, you'd get into crypto, you're going to be an alpha. Look at me and my Lamborghinis, and yeah, I beat women. Look at, I have all these women on leashes, that like serve me. And I think for men who increasingly feel disempowered by our economic system of sort of runaway capitalism and record inequality, that is feeding this movement very much. Because when I talk to a lot of sort of radicalized young men, they don't start by going to the incel forums. Usually, some I'm sure do. Most of the time they start listening to like hustle culture, or like a crypto podcast, or like like they're sort of starting down this path of radicalization through entrepreneurship type shit, So yeah.
It was really in our study of that incels forum, the world's biggest one. We found that the people who'd set up that forum had set up 3 additional forums, which were sort of feeders to the incels forum. And the 3 forum, one of them was for young men, for young people with suicidal ideation. So it was a suicide forum.
Overtly preying on the most vulnerable people.
Right. The second one was a looks maxing forum, and it was, looks maxing is kind of this thing where young men are being encouraged to do pretty extreme stuff, like literally breaking their jaws to reconstruct them so they've got a jaw. And you're like, kid, you look fine. You look great, actually. But like with men with body dysmorphia, and the third one was a forum for NEETs, so kids who are not in employment, education, or training. So like literally the 3 most vulnerable guys with extreme body dysmorphia, guys with extreme mental health challenges and suicidal ideation, and guys who can't find work, employment, or training and just feel left behind. They know what they're doing, Taylor.
Yes, they do, because the people that recruit these, the extremists that recruit these armies of, frankly, young men that are being duped and sold a lie and often paying money for courses from Andrew Tate and all this stuff, like they're I mean, they're ultimately exploited by the system too in some ways. Um, it's an intentional business model. Like, this is a business model that these influencers have built, and they know their target audience, and they know how to exploit their target audience and how to emotionally manipulate their target audience. And they're just running rampant, and they're able to do this over and over again. And I think it's like, again, it's exacerbated by all of these big systemic problems: lack of mental health care, the horrible body standards, which is actually misogyny. Like,
Yeah.
there's that meme on Twitter of, like, what men think a woman wants versus like what women want. And it's like a guy with a dad bod, and then like what men think, and it's like some steroided up guy. And it's like, so much of this is just performing masculinity for other men.
Yeah.
But it's a lot of young men that feel disempowered and feel isolated. And I just wish that people could reach them sooner and realize that they're isolated because of capitalism and because of these broader issues. It's not women, it's not your mom that's oppressing you. But I know that that's a very, like, it's just a very captivating narrative for like a 14-year-old boy.
Yeah, it's so true. So look, I mean, the reason why this is kind of on the agenda at the moment, people are talking about these issues, in part is because of Netflix's show Adolescence, which was #1 around the world. It did incredibly well. It's a British-made show, which I'm very proud of, starring Stephen Graham he's from Liverpool, which is the rival city to my home city of Manchester. But ignore him. But he's a wonderful actor. But it has sparked a global conversation about the dangers of incel culture and extreme misogyny and the sort of the manosphere. In your reporting, how have you seen incel and manosphere rhetoric affect young people, especially boys and teenagers?
Well, I think they're just incredibly susceptible to it in a way that they weren't even 5 years or 10 years ago. 10 years ago, Gamergate was still a fringe movement. It was not like this sort of hateful rhetoric was just simply not normalized, certainly not being espoused by people in such positions of power and leadership in the government and in media as well. And I think we've seen a shift in media where now Joe Rogan and these folks are some of the biggest, names in media in a way that they weren't 10 years ago. We've seen a shift in our political system, and we've seen a shift in the internet and what these platforms reward and what they feel tolerable. I think it's important to consider this problem alongside the rise of algorithmic feeds. I'm not anti-algorithmic feed, but I think that look at Elon Musk's Twitter and how he's wielded that algorithm to push hate and to push misogyny and using his own platform to do that. I think it's concerning, and it does lead to the mainstreaming of a lot of these ideas. And so I just see a lot more young people today falling for it, where I feel like when I see a young boy, I have to be like, guys, like, just please, like, somebody reach out to this man. And unfortunately, there are not a lot of people speaking to those men outside of these extremists.
Yeah, I've got 2 younger brothers and 4 younger sisters, and like a lot of nephews and nieces, as you'd imagine. And I like they are my kind of little focus group of people, and to see how these influences affect them. And I see sometimes the most mainstreamed elements, the figures, I mean, you call them influencers, they're kind of groomers to me. They are, but I see the most mainstream ones actually touching them, and they'll like put something into our family WhatsApp, and I'll be like, what the hell? Like, that's just wild. I want to go back to something we talked about earlier on a little bit, and our latest research, which came out couple of week ago or something, looking at a relook at this incels forum 2 years later, but in the wake of Adolescence. And one of the things worth saying is that they themselves said that there's been a massive spike in traffic since Adolescence, and it's a really good example that sometimes, I think if I've got one criticism of Adolescence, they didn't have an episode 5 which said, okay, so what do we do about it? And obviously that's a TV show, and they're not going to do that. But like, you know what I mean? Like, But the kids on the people on the largest incel forum reacted to Adolescence with sort of renewed misogyny and calls for violence, but also with a lot of racism and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. And we talked earlier about like how hate can intersect. But do you often see those like really different types of hate intersecting, sort of, cross-fertilizing, and what do you think makes that happen?
I mean, well, misogyny is just such a core hate, right? But you see it intersect so heavily with ableism, with homophobia, with racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, literally all forms of hate. I think of there was this viral tweet yesterday, the day before, of this guy hating on these three, again, ones female game developers. These three women that, by the way, have worked in the game industry for decades, that worked on some of the most influential games of our time, but they're all a little bit heavier set women. One has a different color hair. I don't know what their sexuality is or whatever, but they're perceived as sort of like liberal, woke women or whatever. And the comments below, they're not just hating on them for being women. There's rampant homophobia, like
Yeah.
rampant. I mean, I don't think you can separate the rise of misogyny from the anti-trans hate. We saw a cisgender woman beat up recently for going into a female bathroom because she didn't look feminine enough. And so I guess they thought that she was, trans or, whatever. This is terrible because, again, it goes back to the policing of women's bodies and the policing of women. And yeah, it's just completely intertwined. And I don't think we can address one form of hate without recognizing, like, fundamentally, these are hateful ideologies that are all intertwined with each other.
Yeah. It's amazing how frequently we see them in the same spaces, and it doesn't matter, like, what we're studying, whether we're studying like anti-Black racism or hatred against Jewish people or against LGBTQ plus people, but we see everything kind of intersecting, cross-fertilizing. We see tropes intermixing, and we actually did a study a couple of years ago, no more than that, 3 or 4 years ago, called Malgorithm, which was during the pandemic, and we set up accounts on Instagram which were following like QAnon and anti-Semite accounts, and then we set up other accounts which were following anti-vax and COVID disinformation accounts, and we found that the algorithm was cross-feeding content from one to the other. So like if you were looking at QAnon stuff, you were actually getting anti-vax conspiracy theories. If you're looking at anti-vax conspiracy theories, you were getting anti-Semitism. And that sort of explains to an extent the cross-fertilization of some of these fringe and malignant ideologies and belief systems and disinformation narratives, which then kind of create a really, like, that's why I always feel when I'm looking at the sort of the worldviews of some of these emerging groups, and I'm like, it's incoherent.
But their hatred, obviously, too, towards like Black women, towards Muslim women, towards any non-white woman, right? Like that feeds in, and disabled women, right? And then you have the health supremacy and the anti-vax, like Maha movement. Like there's just so many levels and layers of hate, but they're all, like you said, it's all sort of like 1 degree away from each other.
So let me ask you a simple question then. What's the answer to this problem, Taylor Lorenz?
Oh gosh. Well, what is the answer? I personally think that we need to address broader systemic issues in society. Like, this is a conversation about the internet, and there are things that we can do to make the internet safer and better. But I think a lot of people ascribe this problem solely to the internet, and they don't recognize exactly what you said before. There's this symbiotic sort of issues, and we need to fix a lot of bigger issues with our economic system as well. We need to fix, just a lot of like broader systemic economic and political issues that are making men more vulnerable and making all people more vulnerable to this hateful ideology. It's the same way how, like, we see the rise of the Maha movement with the decline of healthcare, access to healthcare, things like that. And so I think we need to look at bigger problems and say, okay, what's feeding this? Is it lack of mental health resources? Is it our economic system? Like, how can we sort of de-radicalize people before they even log on to the internet, right? Like, how are they not even feeling in that headspace where they're going to go down that rabbit hole? And then, we do need to figure out ways to, effectively mitigate the harms of this content online without giving the tech companies more power over censorship, which is unfortunately what I think is happening now, where we see these problems, we want it fixed, and so we say, oh, okay, so we're actually going to censor everything. And for instance, things like the Kids Online Safety Act, a terrible piece of legislation in my mind, where, Marsha Blackburn literally said she wants to pass it to eradicate the transgender in society. we're handing the government, the Trump administration, a loaded gun to censor, essentially like encourage these platforms to censor content online. Look at how Mark Zuckerberg's free speech initiative is going. They're not going to censor the harmful content, the actually like dangerous content. They're going to censor LGBTQ content, reproductive justice content, LGBT, content that is feminist content that the government, our current government, considers harmful. Our current government doesn't consider manosphere shit harmful, unfortunately. So that's a big problem.
I agree with you on so many levels, and this is a multifactorial problem, right? There's so many different causes. The etiology is complex of this malignancy, and I run an organization that looks specifically at one aspect of it. How do you create transparency and accountability for social media platforms? And I profoundly believe that these platforms which span the entire earth and have significant impacts all over the world, there is no way that we can continue with a situation where there is a black box, there's a few dials on it, which only one person gets to control, and there's zero accountability. No one can ask them a question. And like if you research them, they sue you as well, because that's what happened to CCDH.
That's exactly right. And I never even got to the second part, not to interrupt.
Sorry.
Transparency. Like none of these like censorship laws that are being pushed in Congress right now in the US are pushing for transparency. Like you said, researchers these are black boxes. We need to understand. And by the way, this would de-radicalize. This would help with so much stuff. Like right now, content is banned, right? And they don't know why it's like you should have information. They should open the APIs back up. They should allow researchers to come in. We need to shine a light on the inside of these organizations and stop listening to them when they say, oh, it's a proprietary da. No, you should open source your algorithm and people should understand how it works. Because otherwise, like you said, it's just this black box that there's no accountability, and they shut down any ability to research the platform. And then like TikTok did, it's like, yeah, I get it. People were doing bad research with the hashtag stuff, but now you can't get any data. So now we have no data. Like it's frustrating.
I mean, one of the ironies is that the social media companies keep talking about how they're being censored by the people. And you're like, and like when people criticize them, they're like, that's censorship. And you're like, no, that's discourse. And that's First Amendment protected activity. And we want informed discourse, which is the reason for the First Amendment. The First Amendment was there to allow people to be able to come to a judgment on the facts, and to have information about it. And, I run a 501c3, a US charity. So like the amount of disclosures I have to do about my organization is unbelievable. Like we spend tens of thousands of dollars on compliance with the law, hundreds of thousands of dollars on compliance with the law. But these platforms are beyond anyone's scrutiny. Look, one final question. Is there one thing that you wish more people understood about this problem?
Oh, gosh. Just how normalized it is. I wrote a bunch recently about the hate campaign against Blake Lively, and how basically these people that were running this misogynistic hate campaign against Amber Heard, are now running the same playbook on Blake Lively. And I think sometimes we see these high profile examples of misogyny, especially against privileged white women. And there's not a lot of sympathy. And you see a lot of people on the left be like, oh, well, she's a rich celebrity and she got married on a plantation. She's problematic. Who cares if she gets that hate? You should care, because these high profile examples are then used to sort of mainstream hate, and they're used for audience capture for the right. And the right is so good at weaponizing pop culture coverage and sort of like mainstream, not political coverage to radicalize people. And you're just seeing a lot more of that actually in female spaces. Obviously, a lot has been discussed of like the trad wife movement, which I think is sort of the complement to like the manosphere. But we're just seeing I just see so much more misogyny from women. And as a woman, that's concerning, because you see women, especially young women, espousing a bunch of stuff. I think of also just like, like the movement of these young women that are like, why do I have to work? I don't want to work. And it's like, no, your problem again is capitalism. The problem isn't like you want the choice to work or not. But you don't, this trad wife fantasy that you're being sold is also a lie.
You and I have known each other some time. We've talked offline as well, not on the record. And that I set up CCDH after the murder of my colleague. But it's never escaped me that when this psychopath who'd been radicalized online was choosing someone to shoot and stab and beat to death, he chose a physically small young woman a mother of two to murder. And I know that the misogyny, it's an eternal problem in our society. It's been there from the beginning, and it's something that we have to be vigilant and fight against all the time. And this new vector that's being used for the spreading of misogynist ideas, digital spaces, I think, over time, I think it's through reporting like yours. I think it's through advocacy and from opening the floodlights to how we are being manipulated and lied to, and the damage that does to society. Because if young men believe they can't have relationships with women that are more than the sum of their parts, that it has to be about domination and a zero-sum game, they will never get to enjoy what those that came before them have, which are relationships which are so much more than the sum of their parts. And I want everyone to be able to feel that experience. It's one of the most glorious things that I've had the benefit of experiencing in my life. So look, thank you, Taylor. Thank you for the work that you do, for your leadership, you've taught me along the way as well. You've opened my eyes and you've helped me to understand things. And I'm so grateful. So thanks, Taylor.
Well, thank you for doing all the work that you do, because you guys just do such important, and I encourage everybody to follow CCDH too. It's at Counter Hate, but it's like you really do a great job looking into these spaces and diving into the depths of the internet. So I appreciate you.
I'll see you in LA sometime.
See you soon. Yes.